In Kalmuck.
Bella, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I'll start in English because there were some attendees that preferred to hear it in Russian, but I'll start in English, and if you will want, so I'll switch. Okay, so here we can see our hero. This is Dionigi Filippo Ballatri, who was a castrato. There is some resonance. Is it okay? You hear me?
I guess probably the sound of NB sterting is on, and therefore there is some echo.
Okay.
Possible to.
Okay, now I don't hear the echo, so I
Seems
can see.
better.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. So this is Filippo Ballatri, a castrato who is not as famous as his colleagues like Bernacchi, Senesino, or Farinelli. Ballatri's relatively modest fame, partly due to the fact that he appeared as a church and a chamber singer in geographically and culturally remote courts, has prevented his name from becoming a household one among music historians. But we have a number of his portraits. So this is just a fragment of a big picture, which is called Hofkonzert in Schloss Ismaning by Horimans. It's in Munich. And here Ballatri is sitting near the harpsichord and playing because he's the maestro di capella. And we have a caricature. The original is in the famous Albumcini, by Antonio Maria Zanetti. He is Ballatri. And there are two copies. One is in Great Britain, and the one is in the possession of Israel Museum. It is from the former Francesco Algarotti's collection. They all are very similar, but there are differences, and the differences are symbolic, but I will not talk about it now. It's just now, it looks like a quest for children, just find the 10 differences between these pictures. So, and the Ballatri is famous via belles lettres and fiction. So here we can see the fiction novel by Christine Wunicke, Die Nachtigall des Zaren, and even Ballatri and his brother Ferrante appear in one of the Disney movies. There is a sketch. Now I will explain why does this happen if he is not as famous as Farinelli or someone of his stating, but showing little inclination to sing on stage notwithstanding, Ballatri's career became one of the most spectacular than a musical has even been granted. Ballatri is the only castrato singer who left behind written testimony of his life, a combination of a travelogue, memoirs, and autobiography. The importance of his writing, for a long time overlooked by cultural historians, should not be underestimated. It is a fascinating insight into the psychology and physiology of castrati, historically synchronized and socially contextualized views on issues of gender and sexuality, singular observations of a traveler, and testimony of a witness regarding European history and culture. His autobiography, Vitae Viaggi, provides a detailed account on Ballatri's life up to 1732. He was born in 1782, so up to 1732, all this period is described in his biography, Vitae Viaggi. It's a huge book published 4 years ago by Maria di Salvo. And the manuscript was considered lost because starting from 1962, it was just held by the Russian State Library named after Lenin in Moscow. It is a manuscript hidden there in the manuscript department, a huge one, And actually, it was out of consideration. There is a call number, but no one attended to it, but one researcher, Yulia Gerasimova, because it was in Italian and there were not enough researchers. So only lately we got this chance to study this very interesting document. And when I said that he left behind his autobiography, it's actually not exact, because there are two biographies by Ballatri. This one is in prose, in 9 books, as I said, a huge manuscript, and another one is in verses. It is called Frutti del Mondo, and Frutti del Mondo was saved in Bavaria, in Munich, in Staatsbibliothek in Munich. It is still there, and it's open access online. And moreover, it was published in a concise form 100 years ago. So until recently, this autobiography, Frutti del Mondo, was considered his only one survived autobiography. It is written in verses. It has 2,660 quatrains, metric quatrains, in enclosed rhymes. So this is the second autobiography. So while the Frutti del Mondo was safely preserved in Bavaria, the adventures of the Vitae Viaggi resemble the peripatetic life of its own authors. And Ballatri sketched by himself that nasqui in Pisa, andai in Moscovia, tornai alla patria, son in Baviera, ne so dove morò. The origin of the extraordinary fate of Ballatri, a young singer in service at Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici, stems from a visit of the Russian envoy Prince Pyotr Golitsyn, who arrived in Italy in 1697 to study sea navigation. Actually, Pyotr Golitsyn was a Russian envoy, and Pyotr the Great, the young Pyotr the First, was supposed to arrive later, but he remained in Moscow due to the Streltsy revolt, the same revolt that we can know from Mussorgsky's Khovanshchina. So, knowing Tsar Peter's desire to introduce his subjects to European values and his love of collecting curiosities like Kunstkamera, Golitsyn begged Cosimo to allow him to take Ballatri, who was then 16 years old, castrato, for a trip to Muscovy. Thus, Philippe was shipped off to Russia and ordered by Cosimo to give a detailed report of his experience. How do we know? Because actually Cosimo de' Medici ordered Ballatri to write all the reports in his diary. The diaries did not survive, but Ballatri writes in both Frutti del Mondo and Vitae Viaggi that actually all the written here is based on his diaries. Now, this is a comparative table of Vitae Viaggi in 9 books, and there is supposed to be a missing book between 6 and 7, because about 10 years between 1703 to 1713 are missing in this description. So now I'll talk about the structure of Vitae Viaggi. And the Frutti del Mondo, it's a much subtler manuscript, only in 2 parts, in verses, as I said. So 6 out of 9 parts of Vitae Viaggi are entirely occupied with the highlight of Ballatri's long life and career, his 2.5, even not 3, not full 3 years serving Peter the Great in Muscovy between 1698 to 1701. Filippo followed Golitsyn to Venice, and it took them 4 months via Vienna, Wrocław, Warsaw, Smolensk, and then they arrived in February 1698 to Moscow. So Ballatri was the first Italian castrato to come to this land. Actually, when he came to Moscow, there was no idea about Italian bel canto and cantilena, about Italian opera. The first Italian opera appeared in Russia, in St. Petersburg, only 30 years later, etc., etc. So what was he supposed to do in Moscow? Ballatri, in his 9 books, he writes about Peter the Great and about his sisters and associates, Alexander Melnikov, Patrick Gordon, Lefort, about the German settlement, Немецкая Sloboda, as a nursery of Western-inspired modernization, where they both, Ballatri and Peter, were frequent guests. In the Немецкая Sloboda, there was only one harpsichord in the whole country, actually. His description sheds light on numerous aspects of everyday life in Golitsyn's house and his duties at Peter's court. Actually, his duty was not a castrato singer, naturally, but as a chamberlain, spalnik. And he was very frustrated. He said, okay, I am a castrato, I am a singer for all the corridors, all the chambers, all the rooms, all the halls, but for whom should I sing? Because people had no idea about the Italian style of singing and about the gender character of castrati. Filippo, in book 2, he testifies to the lifestyle of Moscovian old aristocracy, of commoners and servants, moving between various social strata and urban regions. He describes in detail gender relationships, nuptial and funeral rites, feasts, and rituals. In 2 years, he learned to speak Russian very well. He stuffed his narratives with a plethora of erratically transliterated Russian words, names, and lengthy idioms. Actually, it's not that easy to understand immediately what is he writing there, because in transliteration, this Russian, there are names and there are a very spicy derogatory expressions, really, really bad expressions that are considered like as such even nowadays. Due to his special position, Ballatri was at places and sites normally inaccessible for foreigners, including the women's chambers. For example, in Golitsyn's house, here in book 2, he describes how, since he is a castrato, he actually has an access to the women chambers, palati. Describes his contact with females of various social and family status. Actually, he had a very special relationships with Daria Golitsina, Golitsyn's wife. He tells about a daughter of Dutch commoner Anna Mons here in book 4, which has a subtitle, A Novel. He writes about Anna Mons. Anna Mons was a daughter of Dutch commoner that Peter the Great had an affair with her, and Anna Mons, she had no voice and no hearing, but she wanted to start singing. So Ballatri was trying to teach her singing, and at the end, he fancied himself to be in love with her. So actually, one of the reasons for him leaving Moscovia so early in 1701 is that Golitsyn saw that Peter the Great starts to develop some negative feeling towards him. In 1701, Ballatri left Russia with Golitsyn to the imperial court in Vienna, and we can read it here in book 7. In book 7 as a retrospect. Actually, he does not preserve the unity of time and place. So all the time we see the flashbacks back and forth. Where he took lessons from the castrato Gaetano Orsini, here in book 6, Gaetano Orsini, Then he traveled, performed, and served various monarchs. He traveled actually after he lost his parents. He was living together and traveling with his brother Ferrante. That's why we have this Disney movie. The later period of his life is referred to in his will, Testamento. So this is his third manuscript, Testamento. Again, it's preserved in Munich. And there is a very juicy phrase. I ask you at the beginning not to wash my corpse after my death, as it should be, not only because it seems indecent to me, but also because I don't want anyone looking at me in order to figure out how castrati are built. Then in 1739, he took vows in the Cistercian order and he became a monk in Fürstenfeld, a monk whose duty were all the musical letters. Then he wrote a play, Santa Margherita di Cortona, that was published and performed in monastery in translation into German, and he died in the year when Mozart was born. Although Ballatri's life proceeded in multiple directions, his memoirs contain precious observation on music and music life, not just in Russia. He is writing about Faustina Bordoni, about the operatic debut by Farinelli in Venezia, in Vinci's opera, etc., etc. And he, in Russia, he describes his own performances in the wealthy houses of the Немецкая Sloboda, German colony, and in the Golitsyn Palace, dancing parties, and singing lessons with Anna Mons. He outlines Tsar Petr's musical preferences for Russian songs, and one of the songs became quite famous. He writes about it 6 pages of his Vita Viaggi, and he calls it Canzone Moscovita con molto sale, Soroka bella bocca. So some of Italians actually consider Soroka bella bocca. It's nothing to do with it. It's a Soroka, a bird, white-sided magpie. This is a well-known, even nowadays, ritual or children's song, and there is a lot of versions of how to sing Soroka bella bocca, but in his rendition, it became a true hit of the season. Ballatri's paraphrase of its content testifies both his command in Russian and perceptiveness to local mentality and behavior. He analyzes its phonetic structure, praising the metric grace and tenderness of the Russian language and its likeness to Italian. So this is his spelling that I preserved here, and the translation of the first out of 11 verses, and this is Soroka bella bocca, and he writes about it that actually what we can learn from this song is the customs of the young girls, Russian girls, and their anger of the old women. And actually, he built the entire social concept of the Russian high society on his observations of how various stratas, men, girls, maids, unmarried, and their mothers and aunts, how they accept his singing and the lyrics of this song. In 1701, Ballatri left Russia with Golitsyn to... excuse me. Ballatri's first patron, Cosimo de' Medici, was seeking to see and collect people of different race and ethnos. Those with flat faces, tufts on their heads, that's what he writes in Frutti del Mondo, to learn how they live in their lands. Golitsyn already sent Medici in 1698 two Kalmuck children who were converted to Catholicism and educated by the Grand Duke. While sending Ballatri to Russia, Medici ordered him to describe everything, and especially this variety of ethnic groups and populations in Russia. So in book 6, there are a lot of his speculations and reflexia on what does it mean, the various ethnicities and the congregational groups, etc., etc., etc. And he's writing this in prose and in verses. So he's writing that he wants to describe life, manners, customs, appearance of dei Moscoviti, li Kozaki, i Mordvati, i Tartari, ed i Kalmyki, Черкасsi, i Samoyedi, etc., etc. Now, most of his description is on Samoyedi. Who are Samoyedi? It's as well his own rendition of the words Samoa. Samoa or Lopari, it's Lapland inhabitants. It's semi-nomadic group of a very, very northern population on the Kolsky Peninsula. So he is writing about Samoyedi all the time. And one of his observations sounds like this. I have noticed that it seems that the world has 3 different nations, and that this can be distinguished, is undeniable. Moors are like no one else. The Kalmyks are completely different from Moors, and we cannot be more different from Moors and Kalmyks than we are. Thus, all the rest of the human race resembles us, and we resemble them. And it's certain that in the Samoyeds and in some other nations, one can see a barbarous air, but the facial formation is not that dissimilar from ours, just as we have also observed at times of our snouts of men, so that they get mad if they breathe peace or show of love, and if they wouldn't be better staying in Samoyedi. So actually his concept of ethnic groups and races is actually very updated. But what is very interesting that he looks at all these ethnic groups, both as Italian and Catholic, and as someone who lives now in Russia. So he says that his view of the Slavs combines a typical of Europeans' disdain to barbarian and primitive nation and an admiration of Russian people's religious piety and patience. Balatri evoked the impression that most Muscovites regarded the Western churches with enmity and show an animosity against strangers, especially strangers that are so hardly identifiable in gender means. For Russians, Balatri wrote, the Catholic castrato is not a Christian, but a basurmano. And he said, darmi dei titoli di cane, o carogne fetende, dannato, papista, pagano e musulmano, o capone. And Balatri describes life, manners, and customs of all these ethnicities. And he has here in book 6 the music and rites and service in Catholic, Lutheran in a German colony, Calvinist, and Russian Orthodox churches, and in all these groups. Because now I will talk about one of his famous adventures when in the spring 17 of the year 1700, he is traveling with the embassy led by Boris Golitsyn to the Kalmyk Khan Ayuka, and we can see Khan Ayuka here. Kalmyks is a branch of Oirat Mongolic ethnic group, the only traditionally Buddhist located within Europe. So when he approaches the Muslims, Basurmans, and he makes a distinction between them and the Buddhists, Kalmyks, with their pagodas, and he describes their architectural structure, etc., etc. they created the Khanat on the lower river Volga and the western shore of the Caspian Sea. The Kalmucks allied themselves with the Tsarist government and signed a treaty to protect the southern Russian border from Muslim population. So Balatri describes the embassy to Grand Kham of Kalmyk, Ayuka, and only the way to the lower Volga near Astrakhan that he calls it Terra di Nemici, and the lands that are ruled by bad people, genteria. So only the way there and back took 4 months, and then they were staying for 2 weeks in the camp. And he writes that these are people. This is the bibliography I was using of anthropological and ethnological characteristics of Kalmyks. And he describes an embassy to Gram Kham and the people of different look from myself and Muscovites. Their skin is black-green, their faces are wide and shallow, eyes are like slits, their cheeks as 2 pillows, and jaw is a stove, 2 holes instead of the nose. And then he describes the meeting. It's a very long description and very juicy one that Balatri was forced to sing 4 hours to Khan Ayuka, and he was very hungry. All the Kalmyks were eating already meat. And then Ayuka, who was so fascinated by his singing, he gave him a meat from his mouth. So Balatri didn't know what to do. And he said, no, I actually, in order not to harm my voice, I eat only boiled rice. So when he described the Kalmyks, there is one of the description is the feast, sport competitions, jump, sing, drink a lot of, he says, laquavita, which is vodka or samagon. And this is, he writes, the only thing which is in common between them and the Muscovite Russian. And then he writes about their music. So when we read, for example, Adam Olearius about his travel to Persia and via the Kalmuck Steppe, there is nothing about music. So this is kind of a unique description. And he says that their sing is like whole, urla que canta. These sounds break heart into 2. Only deaf are lucky. And then they play stretching on the musical instrument that he calls kolasione, which is like, since I was born in Kazakhstan, which is pretty close to this is domra with 4 strings, and it's a stretch instrument. And then Balatri sings Trilla cento cento to the Kham, who was fascinating and gave him a precious presents, and he wanted even to buy him, but Golitsyn said that it is impossible. Then there was a conversation of his gender identity that is described in some bibliography. He says, the Khan asked, who are you, a man or a woman? And he said, if I call myself a man, I will lie. If I call myself a woman, I will lie more strongly. And I am ashamed to call myself both. So I am neutral. And he say, I am Toscan, and there are galli sinomeno norcini, the roosters, that lay eggs from which soprani, capone, are born. The eggs are showed with flattery, cases, and money. And Balatri told him about theater, music, scene, and even about the way that the Basurmans, Muslims, or Kalmyks, or Chinese are represented in opera, for example, in opera in Tamerlano. And actually, the main interest of mine is, here I will, is that there are, 2 autobiographies. One is in prose and the second one in verse. So the description of the feast with dances and singing is much more expanded in the brief manuscript Frutti del Mondo. because he needs to create a morphological and syntactical structure of enclosing rhymes. So he's inventing words and actually imbues the description with a lot of emotional experience and the adjectives, etc., etc. So if we want to know about his Kalmykian experience, this is actually not the main source, because here he writes as much as in Frutti del Mondo, but the style of his description is very different from the one that he's using in the prosaic version, Vitae Viaggi. So he is employing the classical anthropological and ethnomusicological approaches, and nonchalance for factual precision, his limited view, and the subjectivity of his opinion notwithstanding, Balatris Vitae Viaggi and Frutti del Mondo is a unique and invaluable source for historians, anthropologists, and ethnographers, apart from musicians and scholars of cultural transfer and gender study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bella, for this fascinating paper. I would just want to check the audience whether there are some questions or есть ли вопросы.
Bella, сорока белобока.
Bella Bocca.
Белобока. What an amazing idea, the Italian сорока белобока. It's complete fantasy. There is nothing that parallels from the story or the language, right? It's just this sound imitate like association. So bella bocca.
Yes, it's funny because some people who actually wrote about Frutti del Mondo, because no one before Maria di Salvo knew about Vitae Viaggi. They were using Soroka, the beautiful mouse, you know, Bella Bocca. So yeah, and his description is really listen. We could not know what kind of castrato was he, but the eloquence and rhetorical skills and gift are obvious. It's like you are reading Harry Potter or looking Game of Thrones or something. It's so juicy, it's so, you know, lively descriptions with a lot of spicy expressions. I was shocked. And Maria di Salvo in her footnote is trying to explain this expression. So we all are, you know, cultural people. I will not, I will not quote them, but it's, believe me, it's
Okay.
something.
Also, I wonder, especially also Anna, since you are working on the Russian-Italian connections, is this a famous source? Is this a new source that you're researching and working on for the observations of Italian castrato on that period and life in Russia, not just the music experience? Is this something well known? Because I'm not working in that area, or is this new information? Anna, what is your take on that? Were you familiar with this earlier?
No, I am familiar with the edition by Maria di Salvo because I knew she was working on this book, and I have just had a look at the book, not read it entirely because it's huge volume actually. And since I'm working on theatrical life, unfortunately, Balatri does not represent a source because he comes to Russia, just as Bella was saying, before an operatic troupe was active. So he's not part of an operatic troupe. And actually he works as a chamber singer, as far as I know. But yes, of course, we have very few sources concerning the performance, the performance studies, performative arts before the 1730s, actually. So this can really represent a primary source, which is not to given for sure when we talk about Russian culture in general, and a good starting point for many directions of research. So yes, I think it's a very valuable contribution.
Yes, and even comments on Anna Mons. I mean, Peter the Great, everything is just amazing. Memories. Yes.
But maybe that could be regarded as a sort of permanent feature, because actually singers, performance artists were really close to the royal families, and this is actually very interesting, because they gave us a sort of image of not a private life, but a sort of something that stands behind the first line, the first what is usually told us by the historiography, I mean, by history.
Yeah. Thank you.
I can add something about the sources and the uniqueness. Actually, everything that Anna said is correct, of course. And in Russia, in Russian musicology, Russian language musicology, there actually are no mentioning, or very, in passing mention on ballatry, because there was not just no Italian operatic troupe, but there was no theater, even dramatic theater, did not exist in Russia in this period. So he was not a singer in Russia, but Maria di Salvo, before she published the manuscript, there are a couple of articles. There is one article by Julia Gerasimova, a librarian from Lenin State Library, and there is one anthropological article by Schlafly. Actually, they are not writing about music, but he was a musician. And when we read the entire Vita Viaggia, he's writing a lot of how he sang for Louis XIV, how he sang for the patrons of Handel in London, etc., etc. And there are some manuscripts of his singing in Munich, because in Munich there were 10 performances. Actually, she gives Di Salvo in one of the supplements. She gives the spectacles based on Sartori, that he was performing together with Faustina Bardoni in Byron Theatre. So.
May I ask just a question to Bella? You were mentioning Frutti del Mondo, and you showed up the cover of an edition. Is that?
Yeah, it's a different title, and it's very much briefer than the source. Yeah.
So Frutti del Mondo, but in a sort of abridged edition.
Yes. Yeah. By what's his name? I don't remember now, but yeah. Published in Palermo, some 1924. Yeah, so 100 years ago.
Right. Yes. Edition that needs to be renewed, probably.
But there is a manuscript, so.
Okay. I guess we can thank Bella for her paper, for making us familiar with this source. And I assume you are going to have lunch at the moment, or if I correctly understand the program. So we will probably see each other at 1.
2 o'clock. Now
At-
it's 1 o'clock.
Sorry, now it's 1. Okay, 2 o'clock.
Yes.
And at this very same Zoom link.